Everybody, welcome to Chapter 5, U.S. Imperialism, Hawaii and the Philippines, and Early Asian Immigration. So I want to start this lecture with a couple things. One is I hope you guys are all doing well. And I'm going to try to make sure this lecture is not too long. That's the downside to doing recorded lectures. I can't see your guys' faces, so. But I'm going to try to. And again, I'll try to help you guys focus on the most important aspects. I'll give you guys context, but again, try to highlight the most important things I want you guys to know. So I like this piece of photography. It came from 1947. It says first Aloha Week in 47, and it shows a Chinese young lady, a Korean young lady, and a Japanese young lady all standing there with Diamond Head in the background. First of all, just a beautiful photograph, and these young women in the bloom of early womanhood. It's just a wonderful photograph. But the point of showing that to you really is Hawaii is really going to be the beginning in many ways, although California is also too, as we talked about. But Hawaii also is going to be profoundly impacted by Asian immigration. In fact, Hawaii has the largest percentage of Asian immigrants of any U.S. state, not even close, by far. So as we'll see here shortly. So the fact that they have those three young Asian ladies there with Diamond in the background. Now, the only thing I would add is I'd add a Filipino young woman too, because the Filipino population there in Hawaii could be essential to the racial demographics there in Hawaii. Other Asian immigrants too, but above all, it would be the Filipinos being there too. But the Chinese, the Koreans, and Japanese, yeah, that makes sense. Just again, I would add another young lady in there. But the demographics of Hawaii have been profoundly influenced by the Asian community's immigration to Hawaii. You guys probably know this if you ever visit Hawaii, but by population, the 2020 census, the largest, or 21, I guess, maybe, the largest population group racially in Hawaii, above all, and not even close, is the Asian population. So what began really in the 1860s, 1850s, and then slowly accelerated, has profoundly transformed Hawaii to what it is today. So, all right. So I want to give you guys a little bit of background into Hawaii. Now, but as you guys know, this is in no way a complete, not even close to a history of the Hawaiian Islands. I just want to give you guys a little bit of the backstory, right? So you have a little bit of context for what comes next. Like all things in this class is just really, as I mentioned that analogy before, you're at a buffet, right? And you're just chock full of all kinds of delicious foods of all different varieties. And so if you find something you like and you want more of that same cuisine, then absolutely get on the internet, find some good books, find some internet resources to dig in deeper. It's just simply, again, a little appetizer, but to give you guys some context of the backstory of Hawaii and the complicated immigration experience of Hawaii, both for the native peoples and for the whole variety of immigrant groups and how they intersect and how that affects Hawaii all the way down to today. So, all right. Then the left is a wonderful painting by the artist Herb Cain showing, we don't really know exactly, but shows some Polynesian mariners approaching an active volcano. And certainly Hawaii, throughout the years, even currently, is being a volcanic series of islands. Volcano would be a critical part of Hawaii being what it is, just geographically, physically existing in the first place in the Middle Pacific. Now, did the first Polynesians arrive in the islands and discover it, find it through a volcanic eruption? Perhaps. If not, it certainly is wonderful artwork. And some more kind of demographic scenes, not demographic, kind of scenes of traditional Hawaiian culture there on the right as well. And some more scenes of again, traditional Hawaiian culture, the Polynesian culture, dance, religious ritual, the extraordinary navigators that the Polynesians were. And take a look at this map here. You can see as historians and anthropologists have tried to chart the settling of the various islands in the Pacifics. And this is their general sense of what that would have looked like. And again, we don't know exactly. This is their best analysis of when this taking place. And you can see Hawaii would be in what we call Polynesia, and they put the arrow there, arriving there in Hawaii. They were around in Hawaii around 900 A.D. Frankly, we don't know exactly. You can see the brief history right there. And there's a very wide range, basically a 1,000-year range of when historians argue that Polynesians actually arrived in the Hawaiian Islands. 900 is work as well as probably any other number because we just don't know, frankly. Do what you go is the Hawaii Islands were not ruled by one unified kingdom in its early form. Instead, you had various Hawaiian kingdom subdivisions among the various Hawaiian Islands. So there's no unified, like what we think of like a Hawaiian state when the Hawaiians or the Polynesians arrived there. Instead, you have independent kingdoms ruling parts of island or an island. There's no unity. The Hawaiian religion is kapu, or it's a traditional religion. Similar to many other Polynesian societies of the era in its theology, ritual, and code of conduct. There's again some scenes from some artists. The one on the right is again a modern artist. The one on the left, though, is actually a period piece that was recalling the French expedition that landed in the Hawaiian Islands. That'd be from 1817 to 1820, and showing their depictions of what a Hawaiian religious or cultural center would have looked like, in this case, with these French naval officers arriving there. There's a look at the major islands there in Hawaii. So, the really, unfortunately, but the reality is the history of Hawaii that we can, as a historian, more certainly put down specifics would be with the arrival of the Europeans. The Hawaiians prior to this, as far as we know, were not literate, and so we have oral tradition, but we don't have written documents of any kind prior to the arrival of the Europeans. And that would be with Captain James Cook discovery. I want you guys to know that, so highlight that. Take a minute here, grab your pen or pencil. That'd be in 1778 when he, through his extensive explorations, depends on you look at, stumbled on or found it because he's looking, although not looking for the islands per se, but he is on a voyage expedition. So I'd use the word looking. Again, it might be surprised he found something there, but he was exploring. Now, there is some thought, by the way, that the the Hawaiian Islands have been seen much earlier, all the way back to 1542, when the Spanish explorer Villalobos perhaps saw the islands, and perhaps he did. By the way, if he did, we think he probably did not stop, that he may have seen them, and it could be. But we'd say, but really it's not until Captain James Cook arrives in 1778 that Hawaii suddenly is much more directly connected to the world, and in a very transformative way, what's going to happen between Hawaii, the natives of Hawaii, and the larger world. It didn't take very long for change to come, but I want you guys to know that. So when he arrives there, obviously it's a major transformation, and demographically, life forms, you name it, is going to change dramatically in Hawaii as the decades pass. So lives native Hawaiians were fairly altered. Sadly, I want you guys to know this one, and this is not unique to Hawaii, of course, but sadly, these diseases that arrive, we typically refer to them as old world diseases, but things the Polynesians had not had contact with maybe a millennia, maybe longer than that, frankly, maybe considerably longer than that. And these diseases arrive just as they would with many of the native peoples of the Americas, and they're going to be tragically a source of large-scale death among the native Hawaiians. So you don't need to know the numbers there, but I just want you to know a very significant population loss in Hawaii. You see the numbers, perhaps an arrival of Cook, around 300,000 native Hawaiians living there. Within 70 years, the population is down to 50,000 people native Hawaiian ancestry. Now, there's a variety of factors, but the vast majority of that, tragically, is going to be lost to, I wouldn't call them European, but diseases from the rest of the world, from Eurasia and the rest of the world that have arrived there in Hawaii. Now, it's not, of course, just a loss of lives, but you also have tremendous economic change that comes, immigration, introduction to Christianity, European languages, Western culture, and a host of monumental cultural changes arrive that will begin to profoundly change the Hawaiian Islands. But that's not how it first started. And if we had more time, I'd go into this deeper. But when Cook first came across the Hawaiian Islands, they had a fantastic time there. Hawaiians extremely friendly. They shared many of the wonderful foods of Hawaii with them. It was just a love fest the entire time that James Cook's expedition was there in the Hawaiian Islands. They took on food, supplies, fruit, fresh water, etc. They had a hard time leaving. The Hawaiians seemed to be genuinely sorry to see them go. They had a fantastic time. It's a fantastic time. And then trouble struck. And for the sake of our class, I won't go into this too deep, too far, but Captain Cook's expedition sailed out to sea for a ways. One of the ships broke a mast, realizing that's not a small problem, it's a very big problem. Decided to return to the Hawaiian Islands to get the mast fixed. Remember, they'd just been there, had this fantastic time there. They get back to the Hawaiian Islands, and the mood has changed dramatically. Now, scholars argue over why this is, and for the sake of our class, we're not going to get into that, although in another class you could. But essentially, the Hawaiian mood was very, very different. Some scholars argue that religiously, there's reasons behind that. Again, I'm going to keep it short and simple, so we're not going to get into that. Whatever the case may be, tragically, a series of escalating conflicts took place between Captain James Cook's expedition and the native peoples of Hawaii, ultimately culminating in a terrible day of fighting as Captain Cook and a small force of his men and Royal Marines got into a violent confrontation with the native Hawaiians. Captain James Cook's Marines made a run for it to get back to the shore with their boats, as you see depicted right here. And Captain James Cook is killed in the attempt to escape and get into the water, get on small boats, and row out to their ships. Thus, the explorer of Hawaii, James Cook, is also going to die there on the islands. But that contact, though, irrevocably changed Hawaii. It did not take too long for more Westerners or Europeans begin to arrive in Hawaii, and that begins a major change in Hawaiian culture. And one of the quick responses of Hawaii would be King Kamehameha. Once you guys know him, he's going to realize the potential of this new technology and cultural systems the Europeans have, and he would use those to help facilitate his military conquest of the Hawaiian Islands and to found the Hawaiian Kingdom for the first time, all of Hawaii being united under one monarch, in that case himself, King Kamehameha. This is what we call in the statue that you guys see in the U.S. Capitol building, which is right there. So you guys know every state in the Union gets to have two sculptures of individuals they choose to represent the best of their state. And Hawaii has chosen for one of their statues King Kamehameha, again, in tribute to his unification of all of Hawaii under his power, and also his, besides uniting all of Hawaii, but also his using Western technology and so forth as a kind of bridge to make this possible. You see on the left, that's a depiction of King Kamehameha in his traditional royal garb and as a warrior. There in the middle, it shows him wearing Western style clothing. Both of those are true, right? He's maintaining his traditional Hawaiian customs and culture, but also adapting to the new world, technology, clothing, etc., as you see there in the middle painting. And I think we'll move through this quickly. Let's see. I mentioned unifying all Hawaiian Islands. I want you guys to know that one. And quick to use new technology. There's a depiction showing the fighting took place between King Kamehameha's tribe and other resisting tribes on the Hawaiian Islands, and ultimately, as you guys know, he's going to succeed and unite all of Hawaii under his control. In this artwork, you'll see the Hawaiian warriors are armed with a combination of weapons, some of them traditional, and some of them obviously recent European imports. You see that the rifles and muskets they have here were a good example of the rapid use and acquiring of technology to help them succeed in this war. And you see that as well in this painting too, one of the climactic fights. You have a mix, of course, of traditional Hawaiian weapons along with modern imported European weapons too, as you see here in this case, this warrior firing a musket into this retreating crowd of enemy warriors. Now, Hawaii does begin to change dramatically, and I want you guys to know the context of that change. That's going to be the arrival of plantation sugar. Now, the Hawaiian Islands already had sugarcane when the Europeans arrived there. Captain James Cook himself mentioned that he had seen sugarcane in Hawaii. There's a big appetite for sweet stuff, as you guys know well. So Krispy Kremes, chocolate eclairs, brownies, cookies, pie, you name it, right? Oreos, M&Ms, Twix, Starburst. Pick your candy, pick your addiction of choice. People tend to love sugar, and of course they did back then too. And the Hawaiian Islands during the era was a wonderful source of sugar and grew very successful there. And when Cook arrived there, it was already growing there native. So it did not take too long for a group of enterprising, ambitious, visionary Americans to realize the potential for Hawaiian Islands to be a white gold mine of sugar, which could be exported to the United States, in this case, cane sugar. And that is what it's going to become. There's an example of Hawaiian sugarcane today there on the left, and that artist's work, the etching on the right, shows Chinese laborers in the Hawaiian sugarcane plantation. It did not take long for the sugarcane to begin to exploit and become a major aspect of the Hawaiian economy. You see, in 1835, there we go. In fact, maybe I don't ask you guys many dates, but probably a good idea for this one. Give you guys just kind of a chronology of what's going on in Hawaii. But American William Hooper founds the first sugarcane plantation in Kauai, and did not take him long for that to do very well, and for more and more it began to pop up. In those early days, Native Hawaiians were the primary labor source, which makes sense. But Hooper and other plantation owners gradually grew more and more dissatisfied with Native Hawaiian laborers. Instead, began looking for an alternate source of labor for the and not being satisfied with the Hawaiians. And I won't go too deep into why that might be, although I might suggest there's probably multifactorial, a variety of factors. But probably one of them was, the diseases, as you guys know, an illness had killed many of the Hawaiians. So maybe in the eyes of people like William Hooper, they're not the most reliable labor source because you don't know whether they can survive long term. Additionally, it would not be surprising to me if aspects of Native Hawaiian culture, which is not island culture, were not culturally easily matched up with plantation labor for 10 hours a day, 12 hours a day. And that's probably not something that most Hawaiians culturally were familiar with. They probably tended to rebel against that straight-laced, kind of grueling day after day form of labor. Being from a tropical island, has an abundant food, and you name it. That's not the lifestyle typically most of them would be used to. You can see why many of them are very resistant to going, kind of like a rat on the treadmill of just working day after day, very long days, growing sugarcane. And probably many Hawaiians, that's not something that they're willing to do, the majority. So William Hooper and others begin looking around for an alternative labor source, and that's where things get changed dramatically because they're going to find Chinese laborers and begin to bring them to Hawaii, thus beginning the inauguration of Asian immigration to the Hawaiian Islands. That also means the Americans who are running sugarcane plantations get increasingly more and more powerful on the islands because sugar becomes by far the number one dominant economic product of Hawaiian Islands, which makes sense. It's very lucrative for the island, for those involved, for the islands and those involved. But it also does mean the sugarcane barons begin to grow more and more powerful in the Hawaiian Islands themselves, even though they are immigrants. But the power of the money they produce is going to play a major role in what comes next in Hawaiian history. So as the decades pass, American sugar plantations get bigger and bigger, and the owners of these, the managers of these, grow increasingly more and more powerful in the Hawaiian economy, but also politically too, because again, they're the most dominant part of the Hawaiian economy during this era. So that money talks, that money has power. And that also means Americans are increasingly thinking, wouldn't it be nice to add the Hawaiian Islands to America? We're smack in the middle of the Pacific. We wouldn't want some hostile enemy nation, say perhaps like a Japan or Germany or so, or Russia, to seize the islands, use them as a naval base and perhaps a threat to our trade in Asia. So much better if the United States gets these islands. In part, we can thank people like, where do you go? Well, it doesn't matter if he's there or not. That's right. But to use the Hawaiian Islands as a naval base and desire like that possibility of what that brings. All right. Now, I mentioned already, just kind of in passing, the arrival of Chinese. Let's get a little more specific here. So, the growing Asian population in Hawaii. So currently, this is according to the latest census, Hawaii today is 37% Asian, 25% white, 24% mixed. Native Hawaiian is only 10%. When I was working in South Korea, a buddy of mine. All right, so let's pick it back up with how to get a drink. With the Chinese immigration to Hawaii. All right, here we go. All right. That photograph is from 1893, a Chinese family in Hawaii. And actually, by that time period, the Chinese had already been in Hawaii for a number of decades. I mentioned already that the American sugar producers were not happy with the native Hawaiian laborers and were looking for an alternate source. In this case, they turned to Chinese laborers and encouraged them to immigrate to Hawaii to work the sugarcane fields there in Hawaii. So beginning in 1852, that probably is a pretty good, let me highlight that for you guys. You guys write that down. Chinese begin arriving in the Hawaiian Islands to work in the sugar industry. And the numbers are quite significant. You see from 1852 to 1887, around 50,000 Chinese arrived to work in the sugar industry. Now, some, of course, would go home, just like we talked about with the railroads. Some of them, their vision is not to immigrate long-term to Hawaiian Islands. It was to get some money and go back home. So that is also happening in the Hawaiian Islands as well, too. But others of them, not surprisingly, begin to leave the sugarcane fields because the work is hard. It's hard, hot, exhausting. There's some danger involved in it, and it doesn't pay that well. I don't know about you guys. That's one reason why you guys are in college, right? Because you probably hope that those series are hot, dangerous, and doesn't pay well, and sometimes exploited. Those are not good combinations for work environments. Not surprising, a lot of the Chinese are doing this for a while, decide I've had enough, and either maybe collect enough money to go back home, either that or decide I'm going to do something different. So they begin to leave the sugar industry. For those who stayed and go open up small businesses, shops, etc., and do other kinds of businesses that do not rely on the backbreaking work in the sugarcane fields. There's an example, a photograph on the left showing Chinese laborers in a sugarcane field. I mean, again, I mentioned the work is physically backbreaking, all the bending, the cutting, the chopping, and there's danger with that as well too. So, additionally, Chinese in the island had to deal with a growing resentment of their presence. Some by the Hawaiians, who represented the increasing number of non-Hawaiian immigrants or non-native Hawaiian immigrants. Also, loss of land and mounting demographic imbalance. So you had both the native population who increasingly resentful of the Chinese, but then you also had some of the Caucasians there. On the one hand, some of them, of course, wanted the Chinese to be there because they needed them for the sugarcane fields, but others of them worry about what the presence of Chinese bring. There's a stereotype of the coolie system. We talked about that in the context of Central America and the Caribbean and the influence on California. But the idea of coolie of these Chinese laborers who perhaps are a health hazard. They're also an economic competition. Their culture is different. It's a foreign and unwanted element in the Hawaiian Islands, and so there's also pushback from them too. Again, it's a mix, right? Because some plantation owners want the Chinese laborers absolutely. Other whites who run the business may fear that and not want that. So for all those reasons, the Chinese were under a certain level of pressure. Again, some would move and actually leave Hawaiian Islands, go on to, say, California, come more locally. Some would return to China. Others of them, though, make a go of it and will stay in Hawaii long term, but oftentimes leaving the sugarcane fields. Additionally, the growers themselves began to look for an alternative workforce. That's where the Japanese began to arrive. The reason why they look for alternative workforce is, A, the Chinese are going to leave the fields in any case, but also Chinese are beginning to organize and resist the exploitive work policies that sugarcane barons, plantation owners were employing on the sugarcane fields of Hawaii. China's been organizing to resist that, and so they're like, well, we better get another group in here of Asians who don't know better. So when they immigrate, we can use them in the fields because the Chinese are already well experienced and resisting. That leads to the next major round of immigration to Hawaii, and this would be from Japan. Similar reason, again, the sugarcane industry is very lucrative, and so there's a desire, we need a large pool of laborers to come and do this. So you see the large numbers from 1868 to 1929, or 230,000 Japanese would arrive in Hawaii. Now you guys notice after that, didn't mean they all stayed there. Many of them might stay for a time and then move. For example, move to the west coast of the United States. Some may go back to Japan, and of course some would stay. But that large number, not all of those, of course, are going to stay. Some are going to be there temporarily and then move on. But just as in the Chinese community grew increasingly unhappy with that back-breaking work. But just an aside for you guys. So right now, if you guys are doing a part-time job, which probably a lot of you are, if you like that job and you really enjoy and see a future in that job, that's great. Maybe your education is helping you just get further into that career. But if you're like me, the jobs I had when I was in high school and college, some of them were okay, but most of them did not pay well, as in close to minimum wage, were hard work, not respected, and I didn't enjoy doing it long term. That's a lot of factors that say this is why I'm a college student, this is why I get a degree and get into a career that I'm going to really enjoy going to work in the morning. That certainly is not the case of most of the Japanese workers slaving away in the sugarcane fields. Again, hot, dangerous, hard work, poorly paid. All that combination does not lend to you wanting to do that job long term, unless, again, you have to. Now, for some Japanese families, just as a bit for Chinese families, this job in a short run, although very difficult, perhaps will be a step to a better life later. But probably not want to stay in that job long term. Again, unless you feel like, at least at the start, again, most immigrants, both the Japanese immigrants and the Chinese before them, and those who come later, they tend to immigrate because they don't feel like they have a lot of options back home. This is not like an economic step up in the short run, but usually back home, they did not feel like there's a lot of prospects for things to get better back home, and feel like maybe we really break our backs for 5, 10 years, whatever, that we have a chance to economically get to another rung that maybe back home, maybe we feel like maybe that wouldn't happen for us. So that's why they're willing to take this risk, because they're not foolish. And going to foreign countries can be difficult, frankly. It is. It can be very difficult for a lot of reasons. And the work in the sugarcane fields, also difficult. But the Japanese increasingly are tired of the backbreaking work and the poor pay and begin to organize a series of strikes and protests, ultimately culminating in a 1909 strike that would help change the working conditions there in sugarcane fields. The reason why I put that in there, and that's important, and I highlight it for you guys, once you guys know that, it just shows you how the idea of, and this is a stereotypical idea, of course, that the Asians were naturally a quiet worker who's willing to accept what is dealt out because that's kind of their Confucian way of just following orders. To show you that there is some reality to some of that, but it's much more complicated than that. You see, it does not take long at all for Asian immigrants to arrive in the United States and to quickly realize things should be better. And we're going to advocate strongly for them to be better, or we're going to advocate for ourselves. So, for example, the current Asian American activism in light of the pandemic and the anti-Asian racism and violence we've seen crop up in the last several years because of COVID-19, that energy, that self-determination is not new. Now, it goes through phases and through energies. But the idea of we have a voice, we are, as human beings, as you are, the fact that you may speak a different language and different cultural origin, but it has nothing to do with our core humanity and my desire to have things just like you do, just like you do. And so you see that Japanese 09 strike is pushing for that. Now, the strike was not completely successful, but it did help. So it did improve working conditions, even though not all the hopes were made. And again, a lot of the Japanese are going to eventually leave that kind of work. So strike was only partially successful, but more and more Japanese, while that's going on, are moving on to different kinds of fields of work. I say field, I don't mean necessarily agriculture work. I mean just other kinds, their own businesses, other things to begin to do because they're tired of working sugarcane fields, as you guys see. So by 1920, most of the Japanese had already left the sugarcane fields for better economic conditions, either in Hawaii or in the west coast of the United States. Shows you some more images there. You can see some young ladies in sugar plantation there in Hawaii. That's in 1910. Then on the right, these are picture brides. That's a whole other topic. We'll come to that one later in the class. Picture brides would be actually, it's not a unique feature, but would be a well-known feature of Asian immigration, especially in the early years when the predominance of Asian men was much, much higher than it was Asian women. Most profoundly for the Chinese community in the West Coast, but also Japanese community, both of them, where you often have young Japanese men feeling that back home in their home culture, they have not had a good chance to progress economically, but they want to risk it and roll the dice with a lot of energy and hard work, and hopefully in the United States that they have a chance to improve their lot. And if they were able to amass some money, obviously like start a family and have a life companion. But there is very, very few local, either Chinese or in this case Japanese ladies available. And so I begin looking for a lady who takes, man, just hard to imagine. You guys, online dating, man, that's nothing compared to back then. But to get in a picture bride, and for these young ladies, but it's hard. I'd love to have interviewed more. Then, by the way, that's something you guys, again, this class being a buffet, that's a wonderful topic to get into. Maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later in the semester too. But what it would be like to be a picture bride, or on the receiving side, what it'd be like the man to pick a bride through pictures. You've never met her before. Yeah, so. One of these young ladies have a waiting for them there in the new world as they come to Hawaii. All right, let's keep moving here. So the next group of Asians who arrive is going to be the Korean immigration. Now, compared to the Chinese and Japanese, Korean immigration in its very early years was, I wouldn't call it small, but it was quite a bit smaller than either the Chinese or the Japanese, though still significant. This photograph comes from 1909, shows the American flag and a very large Korean flag. By the way, that Korean flag is a brand new Korean flag as Korea is trying to assert its identity as an independent free nation. Because Korea, actually in 1909, was actually under Japanese occupation. So, and I'll come back to that in a minute, but just the context of this photograph, this is the hopeful reality of what Koreans want, which is independent free Korea, because it was not in 1909. But I'll come back to that picture here in just a minute. So Korean laborers begin arriving in Hawaii from 1902, 1905, and 7,000 arrived in those years, and then it abruptly stopped. The reason why it stopped is, again, going back to this picture right here. Korea in those years sadly have been occupied by Japan, and the Japanese were quite ruthless in suppressing and controlling Korea. Not surprisingly, many Koreans deeply resented that, but felt powerless to stop it in the face of the Japanese military strength and control. But Koreans living freely in Hawaii were able to much more freely organize, discuss for what's going on back home, in this case in Korea, and hoping for Korea's liberation, independence. So this photograph actually is showing that very thing. The Korean National Association, 1909, is showing, yes, we're in America, we're proud to be in America, but also we deeply care what's going on back home. In this case, you see their aspirational version of the Korean flag, even though Korea, that's not the flag you see in Korea in that time period. That's really the flag of an independent, free Korea, which did not exist in 1909, but they're still hoping it exists. So in that environment, the Japanese authorities realized that some of these Korean immigrants in the United States are agitating, they're activists for Korean independence, Korean freedom, Korean rights. And in Japan's like, we don't need any more of that. We don't need any more of these free-thinking Koreans living in the United States, being exposed to democracy and human rights and all these things, and writing letters back to Korea, criticizing Japanese control, exciting resentment and an independence movement against our control. So the Japanese government abruptly prohibited all further Korean immigration following 1907. They're not allowed to leave. Now, there's already a Korean population, of course, in Hawaii. Many of them did not go back, but they continued to advocate and push for the native homeland to be a free nation once again. By the way, it just shows you another theme we'll see often in this class is Again, depending on how long the Asian American has lived in America, but not surprisingly, very strong ties to the mother country, depending again how long they've been in the United States in the first place. Now, if you've been here 2, 3, 4 generations, there's probably very little tie outside of some cultural thing. But if you are an immigrant in the last, say, 5, 10, 15 years, obviously you have a profound split between the part of you that is living in America and acculturating into America to some extent, but also obviously a profound attachment, which probably not leave you until you die, frankly, of the land that was the land, home of your birth, the culture of your birth, the place of your family and ancestry and all that. So, and we see that very dramatically in this photograph. Some more scenes of Koreans in the very early days in Hawaiian sugarcane fields. All right. Now this section right here, I'm going to actually move quite quickly through this, so you don't need to highlight too much of this. I just want you to get a little sense of what went on in Hawaii in this time period. And that is the sugarcane plantation owners grew increasingly alarmed that the Hawaiian natives, in this case the Hawaiian king and queen, in this case the queen, her name is Leakalani, there she is, that she is going to somehow, based on her fear, that Hawaiian culture is being overwhelmed by these Asian immigrants and American immigrants and the sugar industry. The Hawaiian native population is going to be pushed out or marginalized even more. But they're already being marginalized in this time period. So the Hawaiian culture, language is under, as they would see it, under this demographic wave of American immigrants and American economic power and the sugar industry. And then now these Hawaiian, the Chinese, and the Japanese, and the Koreans, and others beginning to arrive. And the Hawaiian Queen Leakalani, worried about that, start talking about is what do we need to do to preserve Hawaiian culture, language from this settler colonialism, which would be a term we'd use in the ethnic studies class, that is beginning to overwhelm Hawaii in many, many ways. And Queen Leakalani was very worried about this, began circulating the saying Hawaii for Hawaiians, which is what it sounds like. Keeping out this foreign intrusion of culture and racial differences, religion and economic system, all of this, and her worry about that. Well, it's more complicated, but the long story short, the American plantation owners, fearing that they may, in fact, lose their sugar industry, which again is the whole focus of their income and their work, afraid of that, decide Leakalani is too dangerous to be left in power, and that we should replace her with a much more friendly or compliant Hawaiian leadership. And so in 1893, they launch a coup, and they put Queen Leakalani under house arrest. Now, this wasn't a democratic action. These are the American sugar plantation owners worried that they might be kicked out of Hawaii if Queen Leakalani goes all the way with this idea of Hawaii for Hawaiians and expel the non-Hawaiian immigrants from Hawaii. So fearful of that, what that means for the economically disaster to bring, they decided we're not going to wait for that, and they essentially launch a coup. A coup is a military takeover, and they seize her. The point again, so they can continue business as usual. Now, there's quite a few ins and outs, and if you're getting into a U.S. history class, I'll probably go deeper into that. If you're curious about this, again, I recommend the internet even a little more about this. But essentially say, this was not a very ennobling experience. Obviously, these American sugar plantation owners, without the agreement of the Hawaiian native population, decided to overthrow the native Hawaiian leadership of the Hawaiian Islands, in this case, in the form of Queen Leakalani. That's her there on the left. These guys on the right, these are the sugar plantation tycoons who are running it. They look like they're a military corps of generals and so forth. They're not. That's basically their self-protection uniforms that they designed for themselves. But some individuals like that, by the way, though, who are the ones who are going to seize the queen, put her under house arrest, and remove her from power. The U.S. Navy would get involved in this too, although they did not do this, but they did assist. And again, that's kind of a longer story, which I'm not going to get into for the sake of time, since we're focused on Asian history. But what I do want you to know is Hawaii comes under American control through a coup. Not because the native Hawaiians were okay with it, there's some kind of democratic vote. No, the Hawaiian Islands basically were annexed forcibly by the United States. The U.S. government didn't authorize the original arrest of the Queen, but also they did nothing to stop it, and eventually they would benefit and support it. So frankly, it's a shameful episode of the United States adding Hawaii as a territory through force, economic power, in this case, through the American sugar plantation owners. Now, some Native Hawaiians may have also backed this at the time, feeling that is what they have to do to survive, but certainly many Native Hawaiians felt deeply bitter by how this went down, the loss of their independence, the loss of Hawaiian rule, and the continual immigration of non-Hawaiians, as they saw it, into the Hawaiian context in ever larger numbers. As I showed you guys a little bit earlier in this lecture, only 10% today of Hawaii is Native Hawaiian. So what she was worried about has continued to happen over the decades, well, more than a century now, since she attempted to create the idea of Hawaii for Hawaiians. All right, we'll come back to Hawaii, but for right now, let's move on to the Philippines. And we'll again give you just a very, very brief background to the Philippines, and then we'll wrap up this lecture. So, all right. There's the Philippine home island. The Philippines, by the way, is made of many, many islands. And I think I'm going to get a brief drink here. All right, I got some tea. All right. You guys might need something to drink too as you're taking notes yourself. But we're close. We're getting close to the end here. So, all right, a very short history of the Philippines. So there's the Philippine home islands there. They make up many, many, many islands, frankly. So even this map does not do justice to the very many. We're talking to thousands of small islands that make up the whole Philippine nation today. There's a depiction of a Filipino couple. This is from what's called the Boxer Codex. I'm sorry. Give you an idea of the many indigenous. But by the way, Hawaii, the Philippines is also a source of a lot of immigration from parts of Asia too. The Philippines is quite multi-ethnic, multicultural, multiracial as well too. So the Philippine story is quite complex too. We're going to keep it really short, but any case. So the pre-colonial period from say 900 to 1565, the Philippines was not a united nation. It was a whole series of small and medium-sized kingdoms and even independent tribal groups or nations. So there is no unified, like today when we use the word Philippines, of course we mean the nation of the Philippines. Well, during those years, 1900 to 1565, there was no like united Filipino nation.
I'm still not sure about that.
Apparently, sir, you didn't like my description there. Okay, so and one thing that makes it a little hard for the Philippines is that Philippines, although some of the Philippine nations did have literacy, we have very little in the way of written documents from this era. Very little. The one of the first we have is actually there on the right. We think that was around 900. And that's one of the earliest pieces of documented writing we have from the Philippines. So certainly literacy was there, but it seems like maybe it was a preserve of relatively few, because we have very few documents from this era prior to the arrival of the Europeans, in this case Spanish. So what that means is we don't know a great deal about the Philippines, except, no, there's an exception to that, except that a couple things. We have anthropologists, of course, who can help us. And then also we have reports of the Philippines, but not by the Filipinos themselves. So most of what we know from the Philippines from this era actually comes from non-Filipinos, from the Chinese or Malaysians or others who describe trading with the peoples or kingdoms or groups in the Philippines, and they'll describe them, but we don't have a lot of, almost no self-description by the Filipinos themselves talking about what they were like. Okay. Yeah, here we go. So let's see. The Philippines is very diverse. I mentioned that right, but I want to emphasize it again. So take a moment and highlight that. It's very diverse, comprising many groups, different dialects, language, culture, religion, tribal, national identity. And that is true today as well. So there's a whole variety of these groups, and you can see right here, large groups. And I'm reluctant to pronounce these, and maybe I won't, because I don't want to do injustice to all these Filipino groups. Some of these are easier than others. but a wide range. And by the way, and there's more beyond that. I mentioned it being very diverse. The point again is the Philippines were not a nation this time period; they were a region of many. So, all right. Now, big change to arrive in the Philippines with the arrival of Magellan. So Magellan is going to bump into the Philippines. Actually, he would die there. But following that, Spain is quick to seize on the possibility. As you know, the Philippines are right off the coast of the Asian mainland, and it's a very strategic location. It has possibilities itself, but also its location. So both possibilities in the Philippines itself for development, but also, at least in this area, probably even more importantly, it being a wonderful staging ground for additional trade into the heart of mainland Asia. And the Spanish are pretty quick to realize this potential and would colonize the Philippines from 1565 all the way to 1898. And you can see the importance of the Philippines because you can see how early the colonization there, 1565, which is far earlier than the English attempt to plant a colony in the the east coast of the United States at Jamestown, 1607. You can see that's many decades earlier, even though geographically it's much farther away. But again, the Philippines is right on the doorstep of mainland Asia, and Spain's quick to realize its potential as a link to the spice trade in the mainland Asia, Japan, China, India. And the man who's going to make that happen is this gentleman here on the right. Sorry, that's Magellan on the right. He's the one that stumbled onto initially. And you can see its importance right there in this map right here. So there's the Philippines right there, right? And you can see what a helpful location this is as a staging point for trade throughout the rest of Asia, in this case for the Spanish world. And again, why do they need to go there? Why can't they go the other way? Because remember, the Portuguese dominate the other trade. The Portuguese are the ones who were going down the coast of Africa, sailing, in this case, east, on the east coast of Africa, getting to India, ultimately to Asia from the east. But as you guys remember probably from junior high, the world had been divided by the Pope of the era into two spheres of influence. One is going to be the Portuguese, that is going to be Spanish, try to keep conflict between the two of them. And so Spain has dealing in this case with the Pacific Ocean and parts of the Americas too. And so in this case, the Philippines, even though frankly it's kind of on the dividing line, but it's going to work for their purposes. And that is King Philip II. You wonder why the King of Spain? If you wonder what is his significance, that is because the Philippines are named for him. Which I'm sure if you're an indigenous person in the Philippines, you're like, come on. You arrive and you name this after yourself. That's not, by the way, that's also perfect for our class, right? So the name of Philippines is named for the European king at the time who ordered their settlement, their colonization, right? So did Native people exist there? Of course they did, just like they did in the Americas. But as the Europeans are wont to do when they arrive somewhere, they name it after something for them. In this case, the king at the time who ordered this colonization settlement, in this case, Philip II, one of the great monarchs in Spanish history. And the Philippines will be named in his honor and for him. The conquest of the Philippines was relatively easy, although despite being very, very far from Spain. But I mentioned the Philippines, again, not being a nation, so it's not the same as Spain having to battle with a united empire. The Philippines is quite diverse, and so you perhaps can absorb a small kingdom here, defeat another one through military power here, and begin to absorb gradually the Philippines in its entirety. It took a while, but was relatively easy. Not that there's no resistance. There was some resistance, but again, but the Philippines were not a nation the way we think of it, so they're not able to ever mount a large force for the most part because, again, they're relatively small kingdoms. Now, the point of all this, I want you guys to know, so let me highlight this for you guys, is this is going to be focused on what the Philippines does for Manila galleon trade. Because I mentioned this as a trading source, and that's certainly what it's going to be. Now, of course, Spanish culture is brought into the Philippines too. Culture, religion, Catholicism. So ironically, and this is quite unusual for Asia, because of Spanish long-term colonial control, the Philippines in many ways, as the decades roll into centuries, become more Latin American culture in many ways than Asian. Although, again, it's always a mix. So you still have certain cultural Asian traditions and certainly, I suppose, indigenous foods that are partly reflective of Asian diets. but you also have a very strong overlay of Latin American culture. And so the Philippines is a really interesting case of a combination that one foot in the Asian world, but another foot into the Latin American culture we tend to think of because it's part of the Spanish colonial empire for so long. Racial mixing did take place, but of course, the more Spanish you are, the higher you are in the social hierarchy, as you can imagine, just as it would be, say, in Mexico, any other Spanish colonial possessions. That's what I'm talking about here. Racial mixing did blur up, but still did not erase the racial hierarchy. The more Spanish you are, blood-wise, the higher you up in the social category, the less you are, the lower down the category you'd be. Gradually, as the decades roll into centuries, there'll be a growing Filipino desire for independence and a burning desire for respect. They know their islands are being used as a cultural source, or not cultural source, being used as an economic source by Spain. Spanish colonial overlordship is not done for the primary benefit of benefiting the native Filipinos. It's done, of course, for Spain. And so the natives, it doesn't take long for them to realize, why is this? Why can't we run our own nation? Why are we remaining a colony that is designed above all to benefit Spain? Not for us, but for Spain. And resentment grows, and the independence desire is going to grow too. But that would not come until the mid to later 1870s. There's some depictions of Filipino life, and you can see the influence of Spanish culture, both in dress and dance, instruments. In this case, Catholicism there on the right. That takes us to the Spanish-American War, and we're going to actually move quite quickly through this in the U.S. history class. We'd slow down. It's been a while here, but a whole series of Spanish colonies begin to go into open revolt, fight for independence. Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. In the case of our class, right now, we're going to focus on the Philippines. We're not interested primarily in Cuba and Puerto Rico, but that'd be part of it. A brutal civil war breaks out, or insurgency, in all the places in Cuba and Puerto Rico and the Philippines against Spanish control. The United States, as you guys know, is going to get drawn into this. Now, there's quite a bit of sympathy in America for this colonial desire for freedom. After all, we came that way too, right? And you see that in this cartoon from 1897. You see this lady right here representing the United States, Colombian freedom, wanting to help out this chained young indigenous person. This might be but someone, it just says Spain 16th century methods. In this case, it could be any of these places. It could be the Philippines, could be Puerto Rico, could be Cuba. The United States feeling like we have to help out, although up here it shows Uncle Sam tied up because that was, in this case, the president reluctant to get involved. But the kind of combination of U.S. feeling like we should help, we recognize this desire for independence that resonates with this. But also want to show you guys something here closely. Notice that the depiction of the native Filipino or Cuban or Puerto Rico, they show them as kind of a toddler. You guys notice that? Whereas the Americans are all adults. That's not by mistake. That's a judgment. So on the one hand, you have sympathy. So the sympathy is genuine. We see them struggling and hurting under Spanish colonial repression and exploitation. That's true, but also seeing them as not fully like us, right? That they are, in a sense, a childlike race at the moment. Now, again, we should help them, and we should help them. But seeing them as, again, childlike, undeveloped like people. And that obviously has a variety of cultural, racial overtones as well, too. So the Spanish-American War breaks out, and I'm going to fast forward through most of that. We're not going to get into that deep, but I just say the U.S. arrives in the Philippines. The U.S. military navy fairly quickly defeats the Spanish military in the Philippines, seemingly granting the Philippines exactly what they want, which is independence. Remember, the Filipinos have been fighting against Spanish control, so the American Navy and Army arrives there and fairly quickly demolishes the Spanish fleet. In fact, you can see that right there. It was not even really a fair fight because U.S. ships are much better armed and newer. So fairly quickly, the United States fleet and army overwhelms the Spanish and seizes control of the Philippines. Now, right away, the U.S. gets into an argument, what do we do? Should we simply kick Spain out and then leave, or should we colonize ourselves? And there's a big, long debate in America. Americans were quite conflicted on this for a variety of reasons. One was, is not imperialism against our whole national story? And in part it is. Yeah, that is. Although, get more complicated because we take the Southwest from Mexico, and not to mention treatment of Native Americans. So on the one hand, yes, it is. On the other hand, no, we've already done it. So it's a combination of those two, right? And some resistance to colonizing the Philippines and Puerto Rico places too was not just because it'd be like, for example, wrong. We should allow them to be sovereign themselves. There's also Americans say, well, if we colonize them, we'll allow these inferior races to come into the United States. For example, would you make the Filipinos American citizens? Well, if you do, then they can immigrate to the United States, and then you have a maybe influx of Filipinos coming to the United States to work and live here. Do you want all these Asian people coming to America and diluting the American race? If you're wondering, was that racism? Of course it was. That's precisely what that was. Some is also economic fears, or you get a bunch of Asian coolies coming to the United States, and all that means, as we talked about before. All right. I'll show you a piece of artwork. We're almost done here. A piece of artwork from this time period. This is a cartoon. Shows Uncle Sam dealing with these sudden colonial people, how you deal with them. You can see them lined up here in the schoolroom. You see Cuba there in the front row, and that's Puerto Rico. Then you see Hawaii, and the Philippines is behind that. And you see Uncle Sam trying to educate these kids, but these kids, you see a depiction of them. They're not the smart kids in the class. They're struggling. They're kind of primitive, frankly. You see the kids in the back of the classroom who are doing much better. See them dressed more. They're studying, and they know how to read. They're getting the job done. Although, look around that classroom a little bit more in that cartoon. Notice the little Chinese kid peeking in the door. You guys see that? There's an Native American kid reading a book upside down. There's a black kid there cleaning the window. So that cartoon is showing, you can see that it says, now children, you've got to learn the lessons of whether you want to or not. But you take a look at the class ahead of you, and remember that in a little while you might feel as glad to be here as they are. So saying they're not really happy, but we're going to educate you in the American way. And we're going to, whether you like it or not, but it's things you don't know, we're going to bring you into the modern civilization. But there's two sides of that. On the one hand, there's some truth to that. The United States could bring a greater level of literacy and aspects of modern society to, in this case, the Philippines. There's some truth to that. But obviously, there's also a lot of paternalistic, sometimes exploitive, dehumanizing aspects of that too. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, right? So on the one hand, the United States does bring aspects of the modern world to the Philippines. That's true. That Spain had only done partially or neglected to do more fully. America does do that. But there's also no question who is the superior, inferior in this relationship. And the U.S. is not doing it simply to be altruistic. Yeah, there's some of that, but also because obviously, clearly, the United States viewed it as good for themselves. And Filipino concerns are one of the factors, but not the primary driving factor in what Uncle Sam thinks is good for the United States. And part of that, of course, is going to be race. Now, because the U.S. Army did not leave and chose to stay, the Filipino independence fighters were not happy with that. And this leads to one of the most forgotten wars in U.S. history, but you guys are not going to forget it because it's on the exam. Guaranteed. So from 1898 to 1902, so following the defeat of the Spanish Navy and Spanish military forces, and when the U.S. military does not leave, the Filipino insurgents who were fighting for independence and sovereignty turned their attention and their anger now to the United States. Formerly, they were happy America was there to kick Spain out, but realizing America is not leaving. And now we're coping with a new colonial power, in this case, the United States, and not wanting that. So pretty quickly, that insurgency turns against the American Army of Occupation, and that leads into a nasty war that lasted for about 3 years. Now, again, I'm not going to deep dive in this. I just want you to know it's a quite intense Vietnam-like war in place in the Philippines. Now, the Philippines is quite large. In some areas, it's not going down, but other areas, it is. So the insurgency is not the same in all places in the Philippines. It's happening in some places, not so much in others. But in the places it's happening, it's quite intense, and it's a guerrilla war, primarily. So, again, think a little bit about the American Army in Vietnam, and there are some parallels. Now, some big differences, too. But there were some parallels. It's a hard fight. Both sides don't take a lot of prisoners. Both sides were willing to use some pretty savage methods in the fighting. torture, waterboarding. Both sides do it. It's a very hard-fought, nasty guerrilla war for those 3 years. I do want you guys to know the leader of the Filipino independence movement. His name is Emilio Aguinaldo, and he was a very effective guerrilla leader leading a brutal campaign against American occupation. Some Filipinos stay neutral. Some certainly are for independence and fighting, supporting Aguinaldo and the desire for Filipino independence. Some Filipinos are against it. Again, I mentioned the Filipinos being very multi-ethnic. It depends which ethnic group you're talking about, whether they are participating in this or staying neutral, staying out of it. In any case, many Filipinos die in the process. We don't know the total numbers, but probably about 50,000 Filipinos are going to die as a consequence of fighting. We don't know exactly, but eventually the U.S. forces are able to trick and capture Emilio Aguinaldo. And following his capture, they negotiated an end to the fighting with him with the promise the United States will not stay long term. That unlike Spain, we will stay for a time, but we will get you ready for independence and we will leave at a date to be named later. So the U.S. promised a temporary colonial guardianship or overlordship, probably depends on whose perspective you're looking at. Aguinaldo's not so sure about that, but perhaps feeling that this is the best of bad options. He signs up for this. The fighting comes to an end. And the United States would be a colonial power in the Philippines all the way up to the end of shortly after the end of the World War II. That shows some pictures of the U.S. Army there in the fighting in the Philippines, Filipino soldiers. This is at the end of the fighting. These are Filipino fighters laying down their weapons when they surrendered, and peace finally was restored. But that background gives you a helpful, kind of complicated history of the Philippines, which is a connection to the United States. Now that the Philippines are a colony, it means Filipinos have a chance to immigrate to the United States and would do so in large numbers. Now, that's a much bigger topic. We'll come back to the Filipino experience in America in a later lecture. But returning last to Hawaii as we wrap it up. But all this going on in the Philippines now means, though, that the Philippines is now closely tied to the United States in a way that other Asian nations, frankly, were not. And so that means large numbers of Filipinos begin to arrive in Hawaii looking for work. In this case, as you guys know where they're going into the sugarcane fields initially. And they do come in significant numbers. Like other groups, some of them work in Hawaii for a while in the sugarcane fields. And as you guys know, it's coming. Hot, hard, dangerous, not paying well. Many of them would eventually move on to, in this case, move on to the United States. But as a starter economically, many of them did get their start in sugarcane fields, as you see photographed there on the right, before many of them would move on to, say, West Coast. But they did play an important role. And you take a look at this. By 2010, Filipinos had surpassed Japanese as the state's largest ethnic group. There you go. I'm sorry, yes, state's largest ethnic group. So Filipinos by themselves are the third largest ethnicity in the 2000 census. And the Filipino immigration to the United States would also be a major factor. And the Filipino community is one of the largest Asian communities inside the United States. And we'll get to that. That'll be in a later lecture. And we finally got the end of this one. So we'll come back to both the Philippines and to Hawaii, but on a later date. So for that, that's a good introduction to a little background into Asia in the context of both Hawaii and the Philippines. So with that, you guys enjoy the rest of your evening or morning or whenever you watch this, late night. And we'll see you with lecture number 6. Take care, everybody.